think of Japanese RPGs, the mind almost immediately turns to the Final Fantasy series, a sprawling set of about 800,000 distinct games, each one stuffed with rich worlds, interesting characters, and baffling but compelling storylines, a metaphorical turducken of incomprehensible nonsense that somehow coalesces into a gripping and at times emotionally arresting experience, often both because and in spite of an abundance of anime bullshit. Whether it's impossibly complex hair, improbably large weaponry, or overwrought love triangles, Final Fantasy has them all, and it has them in bulk. Of course, with there being so many games in the franchise, spread out across consoles, computers, handheld cell phones, and even a couple of movies, it's a franchise at odds with itself, simultaneously representing the best and worst of JRPGs as a genre. And that's before we delve into the spin-offs like Kingdom Hearts and Ehrgeiz. But there is one entry in the series that stands head and shoulders above the rest. One game that is elevated above all the others in this decades-old franchise, and rightly so. Revered by its fans and adored by everyone who has played it. That game, of course, is Final Fantasy VI, the series' last 16-bit entry. It was released in the West as Final Fantasy III. At that point, only 2 previous games in the series had been released outside of Japan, mostly because in the early 90s translating a huge complex RPG was about as appealing a notion as swan diving into the giant whirring blades of a comically oversized blender. Fortunately though, we did get a translation of this one, even if it is a little, well, ropey in places, because this entry in the core series represents everything that is good about a Final Fantasy game. It has well-defined characters, memorable moments, and an elaborate story that unfolds in ways you couldn't possibly predict. For instance, did you know that the main villain in this game becomes an all-powerful godlike creature towards the end? I know. It's a shock twist. Final Fantasy VI is considered by many to be one of the greatest games of all time, but it remained a Super Nintendo exclusive all the way up until 1999 when it was ported to the PS1. Here it received a CG-rendered FMV intro and outro, a bestiary that populates as you encounter monsters in-game, and some brand new bugs, though those were ironed out when the game was released in Europe 3 years later. Then there was a port for the Game Boy Advance that kept the bestiary, ditched the FMVs for obvious reasons, and gave us a brand spanking new English translation of the game, which is streets ahead of the SNES original. These are both fascinating ports with strengths and weaknesses that are absolutely worth discussing. But instead of that, let's go over the story of how this game found its way onto these 2 new systems, and that story is tied in with the release of its phenomenally successful sequel, Final Fantasy VII. 7 had a lot going for it. Certainly that riveting story is a strong point, but that was just one of many factors in its global success. For starters, this was the first game in the series to get a global release. For the first time, Europe, Australia, the UK, and other countries besides would get a taste of the franchise, and what a taste. Sony also vied hard for the game's release, publishing it themselves in the US and Europe, and dropping a pretty penny on marketing. This is also the point when the internet had crept more and more into people's homes and video game discussions started to spill out of close-knit bulletin boards and IRC channels and into comment sections and dedicated forums. For the first time, kids playing video games weren't just sharing their experiences with the other kids down the street, they were sharing them with other players online from around the world, swapping stories about side quests and boss fight near misses and ways to save Aeris that definitely work. It's true, they do, I know they do, my uncle works for Nintendo. This golden hour convergence of circumstances helped make Final Fantasy a global phenomenon, placing it right alongside perennials like Mario, Sonic, and those little blokes in the Settlers who didn't have necks. Though that might just have been my childhood. However, it's easy to forget that in 1997, the original PlayStation wasn't yet the industry monolith it was destined to become, and Square, acutely aware of the PlayStation's limited market was-namery, decided that a smart way of reaching as broad a market as possible without breaching their console exclusivity deal with Sony would be to knock out a PC port. PCs were everywhere. They were in libraries, in schools, in hospitals, and in actual people's actual homes.
How the hell do you do this?
What's more, video cards were increasingly being shipped with greatly touted 3D capabilities. Home computers were finally in a place where they could compete with and surpass some of the bleep-motrons people had hooked up to their teleboxes. Square struck a deal with Eidos based off of the phenomenal success of the Tomb Raider franchise at the time, granting them the rights to publish a PC port, and between them they assembled a team of 15 to 20 people at Square's then relatively new offices in Costa Mesa, California to work on porting the game to the PC. If Square could get their shit together, they could knock out a decent port and make Final Fantasy's debut on the PC one to remember. There's just one problem, and that is that Square did not, in fact, have their shit together. Like, at all. Like, it's actually hilarious how little of their shit Square had together. Some of it was within reach, like, immediately, you know, accessible to them, but quite a lot of it, most of it, in fact, was just way over there, like, all the way over there. Or just was missing, like they just didn't have it, which is a problem because you need your shit together. You got to consolidate your shit into one easy shit. Porting the game to the PC from the PS1 was already a pretty gargantuan task in itself. Final Fantasy VII reportedly has as many as 5 separate game engines, all originally programmed for the PlayStation by different teams. But it was compounded by the fact that Square hadn't properly archived or organized their codebase for Final Fantasy VII, and as a consequence, the Costa Mesa team were given an earlier, unfinished build of the game to work from. Whoops! The PC port had a year of stressful development, but it eventually hit the market in 1998. There are a lot of quirks in the PC port, ranging from weird timing issues in some minigames to the fact that everybody has mouths now, a development that Wes Fenlon at PC Gamer found so fascinating he wrote an entire bloody article about it, but it was a phenomenal success, selling over 1 million copies in its initial release. It also forms the basis for the 2013 re-release and ports to the PlayStation 4 and Android. Square's Costa Mesa team almost immediately began work on the PC port of Final Fantasy VIII, otherwise known as the boring one, and despite half of the PC team going off to work for other companies, the PC version was knocked out ever so slightly quicker than the port of Final Fantasy VII, mostly because Square had learned important lessons from their code cock-up the last time around. We're talking actual real lessons. This isn't Warner Brothers looking at the failure of the Green Lantern movie versus the success of the Dark Knight trilogy and concluding that people want grim, gritty superhero movies with no sense of humor. Oh no, these were valuable lessons. Lessons that had a lasting impact on their back catalogue of games. The troubled development of Final Fantasy VII on the PC led to Square re-evaluating how it archived the source code for its various games. Up until this point, their process had essentially been, it's fine, just stuff it anywhere, and that had maybe worked for them while they were just developing one game for one Nintendo console. But now they were starting to dip their toes into multi-platform releases, and that meant they would have to change their process. And it was a change for the better. Square's reorganization of its source code directly led to later ports of their old Super Nintendo titles for new systems. By 1997, they'd already ported Final Fantasy IV to the PlayStation with mixed critical results, but later ports would be a lot more robust and feature-packed. Chrono Trigger found a second life on the PlayStation, which was where many players experienced the game for the first time. Earlier games in the Final Fantasy series found their way onto the PlayStation, some of which received their very first release outside of Japan in the process. In 2003, Square merged with Enix to form... hang on, let me find my notes. Oh yes, Square Enix. And many of those old school RPGs would find yet more life on handheld systems like the PSP, which saw ports of the first 2 Final Fantasy games, and the Game Boy Advance, which got ports of all the old school Final Fantasy games except for the third one, which would eventually get a full-on remake for the Nintendo DS that would itself get ported to Android phones and later to the PC, which is where you can also find PC ports of the Android ports of the other old school Final Fantasy games, including Final Fantasy VI, which uses the translation from the Game Boy Advance version. Actually, fun fact about the Android and PC versions of Final Fantasy VI, modders discovered that the ROM for the Game Boy Advance version is buried in the file structure of the game. You can even get it to run in a Game Boy Advance emulator. The Android and PC versions are generally considered to be, and I'm putting it mildly here obviously, a bit shit, but the PlayStation and Game Boy Advance versions are exceptional. They are lauded, and rightly so. Square saw the mistakes they'd made when they were porting Final Fantasy VII to the PC, and did a massive course correction that not only allowed them to make robust, awesome ports of their games for brand new systems, but also allowed them to add new content, and in the case of Final Fantasy VI, they added a ton of new shit. There's a reason I consider the GBA port of Final Fantasy VI to be the crowning glory of Square's porting efforts. I keep going on about that improved translation, and it really is incredible. It does a much better job of conveying the emotion and heart of that story. But as well as those improvements, brand new dungeons were added containing a handful of new bosses, as well as stronger versions of previous bosses from the game. New weapons were added, the ability to dash was implemented so you're not stuck slowly walking everywhere like you are in the original, and there's even a quick save feature that lets you save anywhere, which is just perfect for a handheld game. And they didn't touch anything else, they didn't bugger about with the narrative in any way. This is Final Fantasy VI exactly as you remember it, but better. This is a perfect port, the definitive edition of Final Fantasy VI, but it's important to note that it wouldn't be a perfect port without the sequence of events that led to Square overhauling their internal archival process that allowed them to make these improvements in the first place. If your first taste of these early Final Fantasy games was on the PlayStation or the Game Boy Advance or even on Android or PC, you owe a debt of gratitude to those programmers in Costa Mesa, California who toiled away at old code and outdated assets so that future teams working on ports of other Final Fantasy games wouldn't have to suffer. End credits. That was a bear to edit. That literally took a month. I'm glad it's done. I don't want to have to touch another RPG again. I'm done with RPGs. I'm never ever doing another RPG again. So next week I will be doing Daikatana on the Game Boy Color. No, that's an RPG. Okay, scrap that. I'm going to do the Haunted Mansion for the Game Boy Advance. I'll come back to Daikatana when I have the spoons for it. And then after that we have... Don't forget to subscribe to this channel and to the original channel for more content like PortsCenter, like Movies with Mikey, and I will see you next time for something super spooky. Well, I'll say super spooky. It's Haunted Mansion.